They are amongst the greatest treasures known to humankind, revered and feared for centuries. But many of them have a dark history, their creators possessed of madness and misery, their finders and holders struck by illness, death and misfortune. Dare you discover the secrets of these cursed treasures? A curse upon a great historical treasure could come in many forms, but it always comes at a great cost to its creator, finder, or owner. Turin in Italy is home to one of the most controversial relics of the Christian Church. It is no more than a thin piece of cloth, but the faithful believe it was wrapped around the body of Jesus. Others believe it is no more than a crude fake. Whatever the truth, this centuries-long battle has left its mark on both sides.
For almost 700 years, the Turin Shroud has been one of the most enduring and tantalizing mysteries of Christian tradition and belief. It has caused division. It has pitted scientists against religious scholars, churchmen against each other, and even led to disputes within the highest levels of the Catholic Church. And to some degree, it has trailed not just controversy, but bad luck and near disaster.
It's a large piece of linen which depicts a prone man lying with his arms across his chest. There's also visible markings which suggest gruesome injuries, gougings and slices across the body, and blood stains and splatters as well on the burial shroud.
What makes it absolutely unique is the image that appears on it. There is an image of a crucified man, both front and back. There is nothing else like it on the earth, and as a result, it has absolutely baffled and intrigued scientists for generations.
The first reference to the shroud is actually in the Bible itself. When the first disciples arrived at the tomb after the crucifixion, the thing that was most devastating and significant to them was the sight of his shroud. The last time they'd seen it, the night before, had wrapped around his body and tied in the conventional way. And when they saw it the following morning, it was exactly where they left it, still tied, but there was no body in it. And that really was, I suppose you could say, the inception of what became Christianity.
For several centuries, it appears the shroud was secreted away in the ancient city of Edessa, in modern southeast Turkey.
The cloth was hidden, and it remained hidden for the next 500 years until workmen repairing a city wall discovered it high up in a niche, and they took it down and realized its significance. And this is really the moment at when, in the 6th century, the image of Christ that we all know today was formed. Christ became a figure with long hair, with a long beard, a long nose. Images, basically, which were taken from this one source. And his likeness appeared then in artworks around the Christian world.
Having made its way to Constantinople, it is believed that the shroud came into the possession of the Crusaders and into the hands of one Crusader sect in particular, the Knights Templar.
The one thing that people remember about the Knights Templar is the story of the Holy Grail. And the Holy Grail is believed to have been a vessel that contained the blood of Jesus. Now, what is interesting is, of course, a vessel that contains the blood of Jesus could also be a description of a linen cloth that is heavily bloodstained. It is my belief that the mysterious image of Edessa, the Holy Grail, and the Shroud of Turin are all the same historical document.
One of the big problems for believers in the shroud is that it then goes missing for several hundred years before making its next reappearance in the 14th century.
In the mid-1350s, a knight in a northern French town presented to the dean of his local church this piece of cloth. And he told the dean this was the burial shroud of Jesus Christ.
However, the Bishop of Troyes, Pierre d'Arcy, appears to have harbored doubts about its authenticity and wrote a letter to the Pope.
He said, I have this shroud, but it is a fake. And I have interrogated the man who created it, and he has confessed that it is a forgery. And so, in theory, the legend of the Turin shroud should have been stopped at source. It didn't. Instead, it has gone on to become this extraordinary, almost self-perpetuating myth.
A much sought-after Christian symbol, the shroud found its way into the hands of the powerful Dukes of Savoy. However, this did not mean that it was safe from the hand of fate.
In 1532, the shroud sustained some very serious damage when a fire broke through the room that the shroud was being kept in. And at the time, it was being kept in a silver box. And the fire was so intense that it melted the silver. Fortunately, very little of the actual image was damaged. The Poor Clare nuns did their very best to clean up the damage, and they sewed new strips of linen into the burn marks and sewed it onto a backing cloth to protect it further.
In 1562, the Savoy family moved to Turin, and the shroud followed in 1578, where it not only acquired the name of the city, but became the pride of the cathedral, in an age where religious objects were a great draw. There was good money to be made from anything that could be associated with the Son of God.
There was a lively European-wide trade in relics, religious relics. And these religious relics fetched a pretty price. They were sold to abbeys and monasteries. And monasteries put them on display and charged pilgrims for the privilege of seeing them and praying to them. And the Turin shroud fits neatly within this great tradition of religious forgeries.
Safely within the walls of the cathedral, the shroud became accepted as a miraculous relic by the faithful. However, in 1898, a miracle of modern science occurred when the church gave photographer Secundo Pierre permission to photograph the face of the shroud.
When he got back to his darkroom and processed the photograph, it is said that he nearly dropped the plate in shock.
To his amazement, and in fact disbelief of those that saw it, it turns out that the shroud image is a sort of negative. And he went back and did it again. And that was when the shroud started to climb its way out of the sort of reputation that was associated with relics in general.
Not surprisingly, controversy flowed from these photographs, from this first exposure of the shroud to the wider world. Church leaders variously endorsed it, rejected it, denounced it. This controversy dragged on for decades, and it did so until the scientific tools of the modern world were brought to bear.
They scoured, if you like, the world's authorities and concluded that the British Museum would be the best people to place in authority over this.
Carbon-14 dating was used to measure the amount of carbon in the fiber of the shroud. As carbon deteriorates at a known rate, this gave a date for the shroud.
What they didn't realize was that this new world of carbon-14 was very commercial, and there were lots of rivalries between the various laboratories, and the shroud's dating became the subject of the most intense internecine rivalries
3 radiocarbon dating laboratories cut a sample of the shroud from a corner and subjected it to radiocarbon dating. And they concluded that the shroud actually dated from the 13th century, which obviously sent shockwaves through the church and through people that believe it.
They said, well, some medieval forger just faked it up and flogged it. Well, that seems to be a fairly simple analysis, and that, of course, was the headline that went around the world.
Almost inevitably, there were claims that the tests were invalid because the scientist had not taken a piece of the original shroud, but a part that had been repaired after the fire. The British Museum stuck to their guns, but this led David Rolfe to issue an extraordinary challenge.
It seemed reasonable for me to say, well, if you say that a medieval forger just faked it up and flogged it, you surely must be able to show how that medieval forger did it. And if you can do it, I've got $1 million for you as a reward. And to this date, so far, they've not bothered to claim it. Either they've got more money than they know what to do with, or they don't know how to create the image either.
But there were no lack of theories as to how the image might have been created.
Some people have claimed that it's an early photograph. Others have claimed that none other than Leonardo da Vinci was responsible for it. They have tested whether a painting could have produced the image and then the paints have faded over time.
For every claim, there is a counterclaim. For every interpretation, there is a counter-argument. The faithful are driven to extraordinary lengths to prove their belief.
There is even dust that has been found around the feet of the image of the shroud, which has been actually shown to be from Jerusalem.
The ultimate CSI moment came when the samples of the so-called blood shed during the crucifixion were taken and tested.
The blood, which is extensive on the shroud, was analysed, and it was found to be human blood.
There's no doubt what appears to be blood on the shroud is blood, and it's even been typed to AB. And the interesting thing is that blood type is absolutely typical of Palestinian Jews, which of course Jesus must have been.
However, even if the blood type potentially matches the area where Jesus lived, do tests show that the markings on the shroud match those produced by a crucifixion?
What they found was it wasn't consistent. So some of the blood splatters would have been made by an individual actually standing over the shroud. So this again disproved the theory of the burial shroud being that of Jesus.
But just when it looks like the argument is over, a new find leads to a new lease of life of the shroud.
I found a coin that was a little bronze coin that was struck in 969 AD in Constantinople. It's the year that the emperor, John Zimisces, actually declared that he wanted Jesus' face to appear on his circulating coinage. There is no doubt in my mind at all that the engraver that engraved those first coins must have seen the image of Jesus that appears on the Edessa cloth. He copied it almost line for line. And from that, we can hold that up against the image on the Shroud of Turin and say that it is practically beyond doubt that it is the same object. Officially, the Catholic Church does not take a position on whether the shroud is the authentic burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. For many people like myself who have studied it and looked at it in detail, I am absolutely convinced that it is.
Whatever the truth of the shroud, it has always been and will always remain a relic of great and enduring mystery. Our hunt for cursed treasure continues 20,000 years ago in Ice Age Spain, and a discovery that was blighted by accusations of fraud that ruined its finder's life. In 1879, an amateur archaeologist called Marcelino Sanz de Sautolo was led to the caves of Altamira in Spain by his daughter Maria.
And it was while he was working in the original entrance chamber of Altamira in the summer of 1879 that his little daughter Maria, who was then 8 years old, trotted off. She must have got quite bored, I expect, and went off with a lantern, found herself in this next chamber, the one with the decorated ceiling, and she was small enough to be able to look up and see paintings on the ceiling.
It's come down to us that she came running out of the chamber and said, "Look, Papa, bulls, bulls."
When we think about what life must have been like in prehistoric times, we don't often take the time to consider the art that prehistoric people have left behind. And yet, the discovery in a cave in Altamira, in the Cantabria region of Spain, revolutionized the way we think about life in Paleolithic times.
The art in Altamira cave is overwhelmingly dominated by representations of the kind of prey animals, the herbivores, that were so critical to the survival of Ice Age hunter-gatherers.
The images on the ceiling are, in addition to a number of engravings, they are painted in red and black, which were the two pigments that were most readily available in the last ice age. The red is always red ochre, hematite, iron oxide. The black is sometimes manganese dioxide in caves, but in Altamira, a lot of the black pigment is actually charcoal.
They applied it with the hand, with the fingers, or with pads of leather, stroking as in no different a way as a modern painter would work. It's almost as if the bison are dripping out of the cave ceiling, and this is a very common interaction with cave walls at the time.
The discovery of the Cave of Altamira was one of the great events in prehistory, certainly in 19th century archaeology, but sadly also it proved to be a curse for the man who found the art.
Satuolo was obviously excited by this discovery, and he published his research in 1880, and that argued that these were prehistoric Paleolithic cave drawings dating back somewhere around 20,000 years.
This was an age when religious ideas governed the way that most people saw the world. So the idea that primitive cavemen could paint such elaborate, beautiful paintings went against the conventional wisdom of the time.
At this time, it was only slowly emerging that there had been an ice age and that there had been humans in Europe during this ice age.
But the objections to the discovery also came from within the scientific community.
The prevailing notion in science was that these savages from the Ice Age surely weren't capable of creating such beautiful images.
These were the first cave paintings ever discovered. Nothing like this had ever been seen before. The only artifacts that showed any sort of artistic quality were carved bones or pieces of stone, and they all came from France.
All of Ice Age art up until that time had been found in southern France. And the French had even started claiming that art was invented in France or by the French. And he dared to suggest very tentatively that maybe the people who had produced bison and so on in France, maybe those same people might have decorated walls and ceilings in caves in the province of Santander.
It becomes a very unfortunate story that De Satuolo really is hounded by scientists who either are indifferent to him and ignore him, or actually criticise him. Really, the underlying suggestion is that the art is a forgery done by him or somebody else. And really, the rationale for this suggestion is that the art still looks quite wet. It's preposterous looking back with hindsight to think that a forger would leave their paints wet while they drew the world's attention to them. Of course they're wet because cave walls are wet. Water percolates through rock, they gleam, they shine, and so on.
The other problem that De Satuolo had was that he employed a French painter who happened to be visiting Santander. He asked him to come in and make a copy of the ceiling. And the locals saw this artist coming and going all the time with all of his materials. And so word got around that either he had done the ceiling himself or that he'd done it behind Sans de Sautuola's back, which meant that either Sans de Sautuola was a crook or he was a naive dupe and didn't realize that this had all been done behind his back.
Unfortunately for da Sautuola, he didn't have the aid of modern scientific technology, which has proved that the cave paintings at Altamira are even more remarkable than first thought. We now know that they were not all painted at the same time, but had been created across thousands of years.
We were able to date not the art itself, but stalactites that had formed over some of the art, and we know that stalactites take many centuries or millennia to form. And that is what really showed us that the earliest art in Altamira was at least 35,000 years old.
The bison, which are the most famous, the latest things on the ceiling, are dated from charcoal in their pigments to about 15,000 years ago. So that means that over a period of at least 20,000 years, people were making images on that ceiling.
It was the incredible preservation of the bison paintings and their undeniable beauty that led to accusations being asked about the antiquity of the paintings and the accusations against da Sautuola.
In a way, Altamira was the curse of Sans de Sautuola's life. It was the most fantastic discovery, but one of the problems it had was that it was just too splendid to be believed. He died prematurely at 57, a broken man.
It's so very sad that da Sautuola, who had made this very innocent discovery of one of the world's treasures, had died before the scientific world had actually acknowledged the authenticity of his find. It is one of those great tragedies in archaeology. One of his foremost scientific opponents, Emile Caltiac, published a paper, Mea culpa d'un sceptique, basically, I'm guilty of having been skeptical, I was wrong.
But all of that came too late for Sautuola. He never saw the validation of his groundbreaking work. In fact, he went to his grave dogged by accusations that he was a fraud, a forger. But if Sautuola himself might have felt cursed, in the latter part of the 20th century, a more modern curse, if you will, befell the caves themselves. So popular had the caves become by the mid-70s, and so many visitors turned up to view them, that the warmth, the heat of these tourists' bodies and the carbon dioxide which they breathed out began to have a severe damaging effect on the paintings themselves. And so strict controls were put on the number of people who could come to view these paintings, simply as a way of protecting this invaluable, thousands of years old artwork from the modern world.
May all those who visit the caves and marvel at their wonders spare a thought for the sadness that befell the man who revealed them to the world. We have all heard of curses attached to ancient Egyptian mummies or artifacts, but no one has ever seen one in action. If they did, then that would surely be the proof that believers in paranormal phenomena have been waiting for. That it happened in the city of Manchester is perhaps even more remarkable.
In the summer of 2013, a video which seemed to show evidence of supernatural forces at work on an ancient Egyptian statue went viral on the internet. The video seemed to demonstrate for the first time scientifically evidence of supernatural forces at work.
Shortly after one of our gallery redisplays in 2012, I noticed that one of the objects in a glass case in our new set of displays had moved. The next day it was in a different position, the next day a different position still. So I thought someone was playing a trick on me.
It appeared to have been turned slightly. All of the pieces in cabinets like this, of course, are oriented in a particular way so that they can be appreciated by visitors. This one was in the wrong place. And further investigation showed that, in fact, it appeared to be rotating on the spot.
So the statue represents a man whose name we know because it's written in hieroglyphs on the base and on the back pillar of the statue. He's a guy called Neb-Senu, standing with his left leg forward and his hands in front of him on his kilt. So although we don't know where the statuette of Neb-Senu comes from, the hieroglyphs imply maybe he lived and worked outside the capital city, Memphis, in the later Middle Kingdom, so around about 1800 BC. We know that also because of the style of the piece. The style of the face is very common amongst high officials and kings in the late Middle Kingdom, so almost 4,000 years ago. He was a high official. He was involved in an institution which some Egyptologists think of as something like a prison. So it's almost like he's a watchman at the prison, which is quite appropriate given his modern fame in Manchester Museum.
The team at Manchester Museum were baffled as to why the statue had started moving. But the lack of explanation started whispers about the ancient curse of the pharaohs.
I think the link between ancient Egypt and the supernatural is pretty well established in Western culture. And I think the main root of that is actually in colonial guilt, especially in Europe and in Britain here in particular. The invasion of Egypt caused people, especially in the early 20th century, to feel guilty about what happened in Egypt. So anything unusual, uncanny, was seen potentially as the revenge of the ancient Egyptians.
Although there is no curse written on the statue itself, it would have been associated with death, and the ancient Egyptians didn't want anyone to interfere with their progress in the afterlife.
Statues like this one would have been made to memorialize the individual they depict in some way.
This statuette was a very important item in the commemoration of an elite person. It was made to represent someone, not to look like they looked in life, but to look like a perfect, idealized version of themselves. So it represents a high-status person, a wealthy person, ready for the afterlife, looking perfect and looking towards eternity.
There was no logical explanation as to why Neb-Senu was moving on his own. So the museum decided that they needed to keep a close eye on his mysterious statue.
It was decided that we'd set up a stop-motion camera inside the case to monitor the movement that was being observed, taking one photograph every minute for a week so you could monitor exactly what was happening.
Time-lapse photography showed that over a period of hours and hours, it was slowly moving around, and in fact would eventually spin right the way around and come back to where it started. And this process was happening more or less continually.
It was suggested that perhaps because the case was locked and alarmed and I had the only key, I was the one moving it for some kind of publicity stunt. I think my first thought on seeing the video was genuine puzzlement, because I knew I wasn't moving it, it wasn't a hoax.
Now, this video ended up on YouTube, social media, worldwide media, and it really struck people by surprise because there was no logical explanation.
People were fascinated in the apparently haunted spinning statue of Manchester Museum.
Once word got out about this moving statue, thousands and thousands of people started streaming into the Manchester Museum wanting to get a glimpse of this, you know, possessed statue.
We had international news interest. People even came up with lottery tickets, believing the statue was magic and was going to give them the correct lottery numbers.
What made this whole incident inexplicable, seemingly, was that the statue had been in the museum's possession for 80 years and it had not moved before this, nor were any other statues in the collection moving. Why then was the little 10-inch tall statue of Nebsenu slowly, ever so slowly, revolving on its base, turning a total of 180 degrees?
As soon as anything strange happens with an ancient Egyptian artifact, instantly people suggest the curse of the pharaohs, which is something that leads on to associations with supernatural forces, with malign, dangerous spiritual presences. And that very much came out in the media reaction, in the social media reaction to the video of the movement of the statue.
With CCTV only seeming to strengthen the idea that the statue was possessed, the museum turned to scientists to see if they could come up with a logical explanation.
So they brought in specialized equipment, including an accelerometer, and they started to measure very minute vibrations that were occurring from visitors' footsteps.
It became quite clear to a number of experts that it was vibration. It was the movement of people, footfall in the gallery, and also traffic outside on the main road, which was causing minuscule movements.
In this case, conditions were absolutely perfect for it to move in a sort of perfect rotation. It didn't move from the space it occupied. It was just seen to turn around.
Which, over a period of a week, showed that complete revolution, that complete movement of the statue round on the spot.
But that raised another question. Why was Nebsenu the only statue, the only artifact in the collection to move? Again, science provided the answer. Unlike all the other artifacts, the statue of Nebsenu has a convex base, and within that convex base there's a little nub, a little bump, and that makes it entirely susceptible to vibrations outside the glass case in which it's housed. And in fact, by placing a membrane underneath Nebsenu stopped moving.
People desperately want to have a supernatural or an extraordinary explanation. There were plenty of explanations, weird and wonderful explanations offered online, but the mundane reality of footfall and traffic was met with a bit of disappointment.
Once the scientific explanation came out, a lot of people stopped believing in the curse, but there still remain a subset of people that maintain their belief.
For some people, perhaps, you know, if you want to believe it enough, there is enough evidence for you to believe.
Should you visit the Manchester Museum, when you look into the eyes of Nebsenu, will he move for you? Diamonds worth a fortune are often wrenched from the earth by people whose lives are cursed by poverty. So perhaps the fact that they go on to evoke greed, envy, heartbreak, and bloodshed should come as no surprise.
The Hope Diamond is probably the most famous diamond in the world, and its story has led it to be associated with a curse, the claims of a supernatural jinx or hex of misfortune that will befall anyone who handles it.
The Hope Diamond is one of the most ascribed curse stones in history. When you first look at it, the first thing you'll notice is its colour. It's actually a deep sapphire blue, very rare in diamonds. This colour is due to some of the carbon atoms in the diamond structure being replaced by boron, and that gives the diamond a blue colour. And the Hope is one of the perfect examples of that feature.
This majestic diamond was a massive 112 carats in its original form. But after many mysterious transformations, it now sits at a still impressive 45 carats. Still the largest blue diamond in existence. Its tale is a tale of misery, violence, and bloodshed.
The diamond was first dug out of the earth at the Allure mine, and that's in what is now the Indian state of Andhra Pradesh. And that happened in the early medieval period. Now, the conditions at that mine were appalling. 60,000 men, women, and children labored there, and the mine had no supports, the miners had no protection, and then when heavy rains came, as they often did, the mine flooded, and scores of men died, drowned in the mud each time. Death was associated with this diamond from the very outset.
The Hope diamond was first owned by Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, a 17th century jeweler who traveled the world looking for gems.
Tavernier brought the Hope diamond back to France. He immediately put it up for sale and he sold it to Louis XIV of France, who loved diamonds, the Sun King. He loved to surround himself with wealth and jewellery, and it was an immediate purchase for him. In Europe, people like brilliants and smaller stones, and so Louis XIV actually had the stone recut to 69 carats into a heart or a shield-shaped stone.
In the late 18th century, the diamond ended up in the collection of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, King of France. And it became a symbol, a very visual reminder of their wealth and greed and carelessness.
The greed of the monarchy led to the French Revolution, which heralded in a time when any ostentatious shows of wealth were dangerous and possibly fatal.
Marie Antoinette and Louis were guillotined in the early stages of the French Revolution.
It was at this time that the diamond was stolen and left France.
And from there on, the diamond would begin a journey across Europe and across the world, crisscrossing continents, often trailing unhappiness, misery, and ruin in its wake.
Having been recut in Holland, the diamond next showed up in London, the busiest city in the world.
Well, we next hear of the stone with a jeweller called Daniel Eliasson in London in 1812. And he actually produced a pamphlet basically advertising the stone.
The diamond ended up in the collection of George IV of England. The king was famously profligate, extravagant, and extremely promiscuous. It seems probable that it ended up in the clutches of one of the king's mistresses, who eventually sold it.
The next owner of the well-travelled diamond would be the man who gave it its name.
The Hope diamond, as we know it today, got its name from Henry Philip Hope. Now, he was a banker who lived in London, and he was very interested in gems and jewellery, had the most magnificent gem and jewellery collection. And ultimately, he purchased the diamond and it went into his magnificent collection.
He died in 1839, and it was quite unclear from his will who the stone was supposed to go to. He had a big collection of gems, a wonderful collection of gems. Eventually, after prolonged court cases, it went to one of his nephews, Henry Thomas Hope.
They slowly went bankrupt through gambling, and the business fell apart.
The diamond's ability to leave its owners either dead or bankrupt continued with the Turkish Sultan, Abdul Hamid II.
The Sultan suddenly found himself in dire financial straits, and he, too, had to sell the jewel on. Finally, it ended up with the Parisian jeweler, Pierre Cartier. Now, Cartier paid a small fortune to get his hands on this. He saw it as something which would bring immense prestige and indeed riches.
Pierre Cartier knew that a rich American called Evelyn Walsh McLean was interested in the diamond, and that she had said that objects associated with bad luck turned into good luck for her. So Cartier told her that Tavernier had stolen the diamond from the former head of the statue of the Hindu goddess Seta, and that the angry goddess had taken her revenge by having Tavernier torn apart by wild dogs on a trip to Russia. To make sure of the sale, Cartier added that Nicolas Fouquet, a French official who owned the stone, had been executed, as of course were Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. But none of this put off the rich American.
Evelyn McLean was aware of the stone's reputation for trailing clouds of financial and personal misfortune in its wake, so she took it to her local church, and she persuaded the church to hold a ceremony of blessing, essentially an exorcism for the stone. And so popular rumour goes, the clouds rolled overhead and thunder rolled and the skies darkened. A symbol, theoretically, that all was still not well with the Hope Diamond. Evelyn McLean said she couldn't care less. She said she was going to wear the diamond as a way of guarding against bad luck and misfortune. It was a brave, foolhardy challenge, if you like, if this myth existed, because it didn't have that effect at all. Her husband ran off with somebody else and then died suddenly. Her son also died unexpectedly, and then her daughter died of a drug overdose. Evelyn McLean's worries weren't over then. The newspaper she and her husband had owned, the Washington Post, went bankrupt. Just as with everyone else who seemed to have touched it, the Hope Diamond appeared to bring misfortune.
Only 2 years after Evelyn McLean's death, the Hope Diamond was put up for sale again in order to settle her debts. It was bought by New York jeweler Harry Winston, but his hopes of getting rich were dashed when no one was willing to take on the curse. So he donated it to the Smithsonian Institute in a plain brown box.
Once the idea takes hold that a particular object is cursed, then you can guarantee that any kind of misfortune that happens in the lives of people who own it will be explained as being a result of the curse.
The Hope Diamond, with its associated curse, adds a certain notoriety to the diamond, and with that notoriety comes allure of the diamond itself. Many people will look at the diamond now in the museum and say, wow, what a fantastic object, but look at all the things it's created for people, which only adds to the drama and the wonderfulness of this great stone.
I think one thing that people often forget when they think about cursed diamonds like the Hope Diamond is how much bad luck do you have to have in your life to be rich enough to own an object like that in the first place?
Ultimately, the stone has brought one great benefit. For decades, it has sat as the centerpiece of a collection in the museum in Washington, D.C. And instead of bringing hardship, it has brought visitors by the thousands each year to the museum to view this spectacular stone.
Diamonds may well be a girl's best friend, but the Hope Diamond is perhaps best left in a case than draped around a fair lady's neck.